Welcome to week 2 of our summer session on Womanist Capitalism. Following our exploration of capitalism's foundation last week, today we turn our analytical lens to examine the historically overlooked economic contributions of women of color throughout history. As we established in our previous session, capitalism cannot be understood merely as an economic system, but rather as a complex social structure rooted in racialized and gendered domination. Today, we will delve deeper into how this structure has systematically devalued, obscured, and erased women's labor, particularly the labor of women of color, while simultaneously depending upon it for its very functioning. Through Thomas Piketty's lens, capital is fundamentally accumulated labor. But this framing demands we ask critical questions. Who accumulated? Who labored? And perhaps most importantly, whose labor has been recognized and valued, and whose labor has been rendered invisible? So, when we talk about the definition of work itself, work has historically been shaped by white patriarchal capitalism. Labor performed predominantly by men in the public sphere, so think of manufacturing, commerce, agriculture, has been recognized as economically valuable, while labor performed predominantly by women in domestic spaces. So think about childcare, food preparation, household management, taking care of the elderly has been dismissed as natural obligations rather than economic contributions. This bifurcation of labor extends further when intersected with race and with gender. The labor of women of color has occupied a uniquely precarious position, simultaneously hyper visible in its exploitation and invisible in its economic valuation. Both enslaved and free women of color, for instance, were expected to perform both productive labor in fields alongside men and reproductive labor in maintaining households, yet neither form was recognized as work worthy of compensation or of recognition. This deliberate misrecognition of women's labor, especially women of color's labor, was not accidental, but instrumental to capitalism's functioning. Remember, we talked last week about how you've got to devalue something and render it invisible in order for it to function? So, by refusing to acknowledge certain forms of labor as quote unquote work, the system enabled massive extraction of value without corresponding compensation, even till this day. So, despite these systemic barriers, free and enslaved women of color throughout the Americas created remarkable economic networks and pathways to independence. Their entrepreneurial activities constituted what we might call an invisible economy. Invisible not because it lacked significance, but because it has been systematically erased from conventional economic histories. So let us examine 4 critical roles through which women of color exercised economic agency as well as resistance. So, number 1, as midwives, birth was a site of both oppression and resistance and capital, right? Enslaved and free women of color maintained traditional birthing practices that preserve cultural knowledge while providing essential healthcare services. So, midwifery represented both economic livelihood and community power, enabling women to possess specialized knowledge valued across racial and class boundaries. Second, we see women functioning as herbalists. So, traditional healing knowledge preserved cultural identity while providing essential healthcare services, especially in rural areas where there was no hospital on the plantation system. So, we see these women healers maintain pharmacopoeia knowledge brought from Africa and combined it with indigenous American traditions, creating sophisticated medical practices that supported community well being while generating income. This knowledge was both economic asset and cultural preservation. Third, we see women labor as seamstresses. So, skilled needlework provided economic independence through craft. And in cities like New Orleans, Charleston, and Havana, free women of color, as well as enslaved women of color, dominated certain sectors of the garment trade, creating elaborate dresses, uniforms, and household linens. This skilled labor allowed economic independence in a system designed to enforce dependence. Fourth, we see women functioning as property owners. In many colonial and early American cities, free women of color became significant property owners despite legal obstacles. And that's a whole nother course on how this came to be. And hopefully I can come back and share that through another course with you. But through strategic acquisition of land and buildings, these women created bases for community empowerment as well as wealth building, generational wealth building that they passed along to their families. So property ownership functioned as a path to both personal security and collective advancement. These economic activities weren't merely individual survival strategies, but constituted interconnected systems of resistance against white patriarchal capitalism. And I want to just check my slide here to see where I am. And I want to highlight 4 dimensions of these resistance systems. So first we had mutual aid networks. They formed the foundation of the system. These community networks built economic safety nets through rotating credit associations, funeral societies, and shared child care arrangements. These mutual aid systems created economic security, formal banking, and insurance systems that often excluded women of color. But here we have them creating their own system for banking. We also have religious leadership, which provided another dimension of resistance. So through leadership in both formal religious institutions and spiritual traditions, think of the Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans, as well as the Oblate Sisters in Providence. Women of color accessed forms of social power and authority denied them in secular society. Spiritual authority created practical power that could be leveraged for economic and community advancement. And then we see property ownership again. I mentioned this earlier, but it created lasting material foundations for resistance. Land and business ownership created generational wealth that could be passed down, circumventing some of the systematic barriers to capital accumulation faced by communities of color. Knowledge transfer ensured continuity of resistance across generations and across race, across gender. So skills passed through generational apprenticeship preserve culture while maintaining economic viability. This transmission of specialized knowledge, whether midwifery techniques, textile crafts, or business strategies, created living archives of resistance practices. And I want to focus a little bit more. Let's unpack this a little more and talk about some historical case studies and examples that illustrate these dynamics. So one example is Marie Laveau. So the first Marie Laveau, because some scholars say there was at least 3 Marie Laveaus. But in 18th century New Orleans, Marie Laveau combined spiritual leadership as a practitioner of African indigenous spirituality with entrepreneurial activities as a hairdresser and a property investor. Her economic position was inseparable from her spiritual authority, demonstrating how women of color leverage multiple forms of power simultaneously. And I also want to point out the fact that Marie Laveau actually came from a family of enslaved women, but at some point in their history, they gained their freedom. So she was a free woman of color who had this spiritual position in her community, as well as she was a hairdresser, as well as being a property investor. And then I want to turn our attention to another case study, Eliza Lee in Charleston, South Carolina. She was built a significant wealth as a pastry chef and businesswoman, eventually owning several properties and employing other free and enslaved people of color. So Eliza Lee Potter, her economic activities supported broader community advancement through strategic hiring as well as training. And then I want to talk about a mutual aid society in early 19th century Philadelphia, the Female Benevolent Society of St. Thomas. They created structured mutual aid systems that provided immediate economic relief and long-term wealth building opportunities for free women of color. So through these three examples, we demonstrate that women of color weren't merely surviving within white patriarchal capitalism, but actively creating alternative economic frameworks based on collective advancement rather than individual accumulation. And that advancement extended right to their families and then to the broader community. So the economic resistance strategies of historical women of color continue to resonate and evolve in our present moment. So let us trace this evolution through three chronological phases. So in the past, free women of color occupied what Ana Louise Keating calls these threshold identities or positions that were simultaneously inside and outside dominant systems. Some of them were legally free if they were free women of color, but they weren't equal. They may have been economically active, yet they may have been systematically disadvantaged. And in this liminal position, required development of sophisticated strategies that work both within and against capitalist structures. In our present time, so in modern times, we see similar dynamics in the undervaluation of feminized labor in the modern economy. So think about gig workers, think about childcare providers or caregivers or domestic workers or service employees. These positions are disproportionately occupied by women of color who are providing essential economic functions, yet they receive inadequate compensation and recognition. The structural invisibility of women's economic contributions persists despite formal legal equality, right? Looking toward the future, the womanist capitalism vision draws upon historical resistance strategies while reimagining their application in contemporary or modern contexts. And I'm going to come back to Audre Lorde, who proclaimed, "I am deliberate and afraid of nothing." She said, "I am deliberate and afraid of nothing." So this deliberate fearlessness characterizes the womanist approach to capitalism and economic transformation, acknowledging historical injustice while boldly envisioning new possibilities. So in the last part of our class today, I want to invite you to reflect on how these historical insights might inform our understanding of contemporary challenges with white patriarchal capitalism. How do we properly value care work, delivery driver work, and the labor of maintaining human life and well-being within economic systems? Another question I want you to ponder: what can modern mutual aid movements, so we saw the Black Lives Matters movement, but or Black Girls Code movement, but what can these movements learn from historical examples created by women of color? And how might property ownership and entrepreneurship function differently when guided by womanist principles rather than patriarchal capitalist values? These questions connect directly to our broader course inquiry of what might a womanist capitalism, and by that, I'm defining that as a system that centers the experiences, needs, and wisdom of women, particularly women of color. What does it look like in practice? So as we conclude today's session, I encourage you to complete this week's assessment. I believe there's a quiz called Women's Labor and Resistance, which will help consolidate these historical insights and prepare us for next week's exploration on the problem, the modern workplace, and women of color. For your preparation, consider examining the labor conditions in your own workplace or community, be it in the past or in the present. I want you to identify what forms of women's labor remain undervalued or invisible, and how do contemporary resistance strategies build upon historical precedents. These reflections, I believe, will enrich our discussion board. And I want you to remember that poetry is not a luxury. Another quote, wonderful quote by Audre Lorde. And I want to add to that, Neither is economic justice. It is essential to our collective liberation. Thank you again for your engagement today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.